There might be some delay, and if I go too quickly with the click-through, do you see my screen yet? Here's the quick outline. I would like to cover 4 sections. As I mentioned before, the risk assessment theory is important because that sets the stage of how things are to be accomplished within that framework. And very quickly, I'll dive into some of the human health aspects, and that's specifically talking about the drill rig scenario. And I think last time I was able to identify some presentations. I sent them your way. So some of that information you may have seen, but I will spend some time looking at the applicable exposure pathways and routes and chemistries, and with the intent of seeing where are the sensitive endpoints or spots in the whole scenario, whole scheme. In section 3, I'll also discuss the ecological receptor component because the environment not only includes workers and residential receptors, but also wildlife, which I think the intent is to protect them as well from any unwanted effects of produced water and even reused or treated water as well, to make it as complete as possible. And finally, would like to spend some time of my thinking of how the evaluation scheme could look like, maybe some points for improvement, and that's where the complexity may come in. Okay? So I'm going to pause between the slides because that will allow folks to kind of raise their hand to chime in. But since we haven't covered very much, the pause will be short right now. So section 1 will focus on the 6 tenets in risk assessment and toxicology. Again, very important because that's the basis for the whole discussion. And then I'll also spend some time on the latest approach on how toxicity assessment is performed today, giving all the decades worth of advancement in modeling, QSARs, and some of the databases and predictive models in AI as well. Okay, so this is the fundamental tenet in toxicology. So for those of you who took some chemistry, environmental chemistry, maybe toxicology, probably familiar with the individual Paracelsus. He was a biologist and chemist, and the combination of the two today, we call them toxicologists. But back then they did not have that expression yet. And the very nifty thing about Paracelsus, he came out with that expression, I think that's in Latin, but I'm going to translate it to the English equivalent is that dose makes the poison. And that's important with what we do because I'm going to demonstrate that not only you have to have demonstration of presence, exposure, but also toxicity for it to be a suitable risk driver in terms of produced water elements. There's also the whole concept at what point, if ever, you have expression of toxicity. So inserted there in the citation, you have 3 possibilities. You have the linear non-threshold. So for every increase in, let's say, exposure concentration dose, you have a corresponding, in this case, decrease in response, so increased mortality, for example, or adverse effects on the organ-organ systems. And that's the most typical approach. We assume linearity to a point where it's 0, there should be no response, 0 response. Then the second one is the threshold effect. So you can tolerate, as a human being, quite a bit of chemical onslaught to a point. And then the body, as defenses get overwhelmed, enzymes get run out, You can only do for so much, and then the response starts to happening. And this is important, especially when you have regulatory thresholds for over which you have to have some type of action. Below those concentrations are considered safe. So that's, some people say, not very nicely, license to pollute. But in our industrial world, we have no choice but often to assume thresholds. And that's where some of the work we'll be doing for the produced water has to also consider threshold. And then hormesis, that's fascinating aspect that higher exposure of certain elements actually produces beneficial effect. And hormesis is not something that is very widely discussed by agencies because that's inconvenient for them. But for example, a great example of this is the essential elements. So iodine could be a great example that most population living away from coastlines are limited in iodine. And this is why our government often includes iodine in salts and other food products so that there is not a deficiency. So in general, our population is deficient in iodine, so higher exposure to seafoods, naturally occurring iodine levels will produce benefits effects in controlling thyroid disease, for example. So that's a very important element. And surprisingly enough, hormesis also occurs with environmental chemicals. I don't know if you're familiar with PFAS, so that these are poly and perfluorinated compounds. We do see hormesis effect. At low-level exposures, there's a stimulating effect. And that's people think that this is because your body is responding to these chemicals, and the associated response in your body actually has beneficial effects. It's not that the chemical itself is causing the beneficial effect, it's the response of your body to that foreign substance. That's what's causing it. So let's keep those response mechanisms in mind in terms of the work on produced water. So briefly stopping here to see if there's any questions. Okay, moving on with some basics, and we're going to move quicker as we go. It's going to get a little more complex as we go as well. Another important element, and this is part of the scheme that I devised for produced water and oil field workers, is the whole concept of ultimate risk is a function of exposure and toxicity. So you have to have both expressed to some extent if you're going to start worrying about risks. So the corollary of that is that there's no risk if there's no exposure or toxicity. So you have to have both. And you see how it applies to the approach I've taken. And then in general, looking at the risk assessment process, agencies like EPA, many states have adopted that approach, is that, and also it's apparent in our scheme, we have to identify the hazard. Okay? So if you have a chemical, we have to realize that it has potential for adverse effects, and if they are, what are they? There's a lot of chemicals, elements out there that it's hard for them to cause toxicity. Those are regarded as generally safe. However, industrial chemicals often have the hazards associated with it. And I think our industrial society is really geared towards identification and management of hazardous substances through regulations and safety data sheets and things like that. So, and then also the two elements that I mentioned before will be the dose response assessments, and that's modulated by a degree of exposure. And the exposure assessment itself, it's also going to be an important element for produced water assessments. Is how much exposure there is de facto or could be, if it's estimated or predicted or maybe there's a concern with that as well. So that's going to be an important element. And finally, when you combine the two, just like the graphic before, then you're going to end up with some type of measure of risk. And often that risk is quantified. So you can have a qualitative assessment of risk, but also more often enough in a Superfund setting or similar, even state setting, you're going to have a quantifiable expression of risk. And this is where the hazard quotient concept comes in handy. I know that the previous presenter, I think, was mentioning some of that as well. But in the simplest form, the expression of potential for risk is the ratio between the total exposure from multiple exposure routes, amalgamating the pathways, to a known reference dose. And that dose can actually be a dose in terms of amount of chemical taken per body unit per day, or it could be something that's exposure media based. So let's say allowable concentration of biocide in water, produced water. So there could be a different measures of that. And we're going to talk about it a little bit. And then the risk conclusion, the deciding factor is whether or not you're less than essentially one. So if your hazard quotient is less than equal, or actually greater than equal to one, it deems you to assess the situation further. And if your HQ is less than one, plus that ratio, then you can deem situation safe. And that's important also in our decision scheme. Okay. Another extremely important aspect in the whole holistically approach to risk evaluation of environmental chemicals is the adverse outcome pathway. Our bodies have multiple defense layer mechanisms. It does. Over the years, through our evolution, we are really hard to kill. We really are. Between the bacteria, viruses, natural killing elements, things like smoke or burnt food, early cave dwellers, when they discovered fire, very quickly we got exposed to carcinogens, very quickly. PAHs and other products. To this day, we are exposed to carcinogens via grilling and stuff. So the body decided it's not going to be so easy for us to get cancer. It's just not. So this is the whole concept of the ARP. You have to have a chain of events, almost like a Swiss cheese alignment in the health and safety forum, that so many things have to go wrong before you have a catastrophic event. So the same with human bodies. So this is important context in that just because we are exposed to environmental contaminants doesn't mean that there's an expression of harm that's clinically relevant, because they have to be exposure first. They have to be adverse molecular changes. In the case of carcinogens, there has to be unrepairable DNA damage that's going to percolate through effects on biological systems and have lasting cellular changes. For example, when we have runaway cell replication proliferation with carcinogens, so that's a higher level type of response. And finally, it has to lead to a disease that has, again, clinical expression. So again, what it means is that when we look at different chemistries, exposures for the produced water elements, we should have a little bit of assurance and comfort that the risk for making a mistake, that we, let's say, we are underprotective, it's relatively low. So we can be fairly pragmatic and fairly middle of the road approach in terms of our solutions without having to worry about impacting human health to a point that's going to be a public health issue. Very, very important. Okay. Let's get a little more complicated now. Also in the theme of potential risk versus actual harm. I don't know if you can see, I can maybe zoom in a little. But also speaks to different routes or mechanisms that need to take place. So in case of human being, and this is important, that folks can be exposed to produced water elements through skin absorption. There could be a respiratory route involved as well, and also incidental ingestion through, let's say, drinking water, or maybe uptake incidental through vegetable irrigation and such. So there's these three different exposure routes. And then ultimately, there has to be some type of dose that's associated with each of those uptake means. And then you have the potential dose and actual dose, applied dose, very different. Just because you got some produced water in the skin doesn't mean that you actually have the entirety of the chemicals that were in the water enter your body. It has to deal with the dermal barrier first, so that's important as well. And then you end up with the internal dose, and then as I mentioned before, through the multiple defense mechanisms, there's going to be metabolism, there's going to be detoxification, elimination, sequestration, before they actually reach the biologically effective dose at the organ systems. So again, not only the body has multiple defense mechanisms, but also a lot has to take place between the contact and external contact and internal site of action. So again, that should give you a little bit of comfort that whatever we do has a lot of conservatism and defense elements built into it. Okay. The organism. So keep that one in mind. Moving quickly to number 5. This will be very important in terms of understanding the toxicity mode of action, but also to be able to predict toxicity mode of action or approximate toxicity mode of action for a chemical that we know very little about. So the whole concept of analogs and functional analogs will be important. So in this case, a very complex molecule, yet it contains 5 potential functional groups that we have to worry about. And some of the read acrosses methodologies I'm going to talk about later use those elements to score a given chemical in terms of functional similarity from known chemical to unknown. So this is getting a little deeper. And finally, in terms of the toxicity, the whole concept lends itself very nicely into predictive toxicity in terms of looking at analogs and categories. So you can have a chemical evaluation based on grouping. Then you have the chemical fate and transport. Aquatic toxicities also be able to be predicted. And all those arrows point to possible models or applications available already to everyone to use. Carcinogenicity can be predicted using oncologic, and then non-cancer effects against analogs approach, something like a read across. So the last tenet speaks to the power of prediction for those chemicals, again, that you need to know more about in terms of effects, but we just don't have the published information, or it's very little, insufficient. Okay, so I'm going to stop right here.
before I move into the demonstration of the human health exposure and toxicity concept as it applies to a hypothetical drill rig scenario. Okay, so let's dive right into it. So some of this work I presented on some time ago at oil and gas conferences that were concerned with worker exposure to various inbound and outbound fluid or produced water elements. I think the occupational risk is something that various organizations track, especially from the OSHA perspective, but nevertheless, it was an important aspect to evaluate. And I'm demonstrating this case scenario because there's some relevant elements to produce water hazard evaluation. And mainly, this has to do with the need to identify your potential receptors. Also, in the spirit of conceptual exposure model thinking here, we need to understand the pathways, and pathways defined as the mechanisms or means which a chemical travels or is transported by various media between the point of release to where the receptor is at. And then finally, also in the whole evaluation scheme, one needs to understand, is this chemical toxic via dermal exposure, or is it only incidental ingestion, or is it inhalation of vapors? That's very important for that, because each will drive the risk differently or not at all. So when one thinks about these types of scenarios, you have to look at each element that contributes to the whole exposure part of the equation at the end. And then, of course, we are very familiar with some of these elements or chemicals that could be found in various aquatic media, either on the inbound side of the outbound side as well. Okay, so moving on to some of the specificity for the presentation I gave, and in context to produce water, here we have listed 1,000 chemicals, but I'm sure there's more than that. And that sheer number of chemicals, when one tries to evaluate what are the most important risk drivers in the whole complex mixture, because produced water is a complex mixture, you can see how quickly it can be very complicated and potentially very time-consuming. The fact is that some of these constituents could be claimed as trade secret, does not help, but nevertheless, there's ways and means to go around that. And then the other part of the slide is the concept of, yes, one needs to look at individual constituents, even by one, but it's also possible to think about groupings. So in the case that I was looking at, we looked at the categories, if it's a propane, friction reducers, disinfectants, then bold, because typically and they're most toxic, and so on and so on. So you can also think about the overall risk, not only in terms of specific chemicals, but also groups. Moving on, looking specifically at the fluid additives, I just want to say that, again, there's just the possibility of focusing on specific groups, and you can estimate how often and how much of the product is used to give you an idea of the propensity for exposure. Here's one of the schemes. I don't know how many chemicals I had in my my universe of the chemicals I was looking at, but this is a demonstration how quickly you can take a very complex data set and just query it and see, all right, we see a lot of chemicals here, but which of these specifically and by group most frequently detected or mixed into formulas, downhole and such. You can focus on the most frequent ones just to start with, because the frequency of occurrence usually lends itself to frequency of exposure and release into environment. So this is one of the ways you can do this. The other side of the risk, exposure, and toxicity concept is to look at each of these highly frequently used, occurring, detected constituents and analyzing it or deriving a toxicity estimate for it. Sometimes you can grab it from literature, and then you can rank, score them according to its toxicity. Of course, it's important to pick a toxicity endpoint that's consistent. And in my case, because this was a worker exposure, I picked the LD50 so that I'm comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges. So then you can very quickly hone in to those chemicals. And again, this is the biocide that seems to be the most toxic of them all. And it goes to say, if something is non-toxic, then from the ranking and scheme perspective, you don't need to worry about it right away. This slide, also part of my presentation, demonstrates the importance of making sure that one uses a suitable analytical methodology, preferably published and tested, to make sure to capture all the constituents in produced water, especially if there are likely risk drivers. And I do recognize the fact that there's other non-published methods or research methods, including the non-targeted analyses that will give you even broader view of what's in the produced water. But in the regulatory setting, it's easier to convince agency if a published method was used. So the good news for produced water, there's a lot of methods out there, and they have been true and tested over the years. Now, I also employed the concept of sentinel compounds. So in any complex mixture, you can find specific elements or element groups that will be indicative of what you're looking for. So for the inbound fluid sentinels, you can rely on detection of aldehydes, amates, alcohols, and glycols. So if you detect those, it's a very good chance that there is signature of the formation, or this is the production fluids, and then other constituents can also be found there. So it's like almost like a screening, initial screening mechanism, because these are relatively easy to analyze for. And same goes for returning algal fluid sentinels, although there can be formation specific, but also you can see if you test for those compounds and elements, you can detect other constituents as well. Okay, there's also the big concept of method limitations. Some methods are best than others, and also huge, especially for produced water. You can get matrix interferences, and your analytical outcomes may not be as perfect as you envisioned. Okay, moving on. Just quickly, just show you some of the work. Again, employing those toxicology tenets, very simplistic exposure scenarios, shift of 8 hours. Of course, these workers will work more than 8 hours. They sometimes work 12, 16-hour shifts. This is standard workday. Assumption of oral ingestion of some fracking fluid. There's also some transdermal uptake via exposed hands and arms and so on and so on. Employing the hazard quotient, as explained before, looking for quantification, the resulting ratio from total exposure and reference dose. Okay, moving on. So this table, again, from the publication, shows the three elements. One is the exposure, and very quickly, you can see that exposure to polyethylene glycol is the highest here. And looking at the reference dose estimate, one can quickly determine that it is the glutaraldehyde biocide that's most toxic in the mix, and then the resulting hazard quotients is the highest. So the higher the hazard quotient, the higher the potential for risk. And in this case, all the elements individually, and I'll talk about mixture toxicity, multiple interactions later, were less than 1. Therefore, it didn't appear for that exposure scenario that there was potential for risk. But another application of this table, so you can very nicely rank your constituents according to the hazard quotient, regardless of the risk management decision. You can use the quantitative HQ listing as your ranking criteria. To, for example, hey Andrew, I just want to look at top 10. Well, there's your top 10. And then you can look at them a little deeper in terms of actual risks to human health and environment. All right, so this is a really quickly summary of what I already focused on, so I'm just going to move on. So a quick pause here to see if there's any items to talk about before I go into demonstration of ecological receptors. Okay, very good. We're about bottom of the hour. I'm tracking time here, so that's good. We're going to have time for questions. All right. The reason why I'm presenting this slide is as follows. Although the steps taken in both human health risk assessment and ecological risk assessment could be similar. We have the problem formulation, hazard identification, exposure, and so on and so. Steps number 4 and 5 are far more complex because you're not dealing with just one species anymore. You're dealing with multiple species. Not only that, we're also worried from the ecological perspective at the populations, ecological languages, holistically. So it's very complex of the mechanisms. So what it means for produced water assessment, that for human health, at least conceptually, is relatively straightforward. But for ecological receptors, it's not that easy. This is another slide that demonstrates complexity and also comparison, maybe contrast to human health. So human health risk assessment, you can see the category 1 or 2 could be equivalent. So organismal endpoints, in case it's fish. For human health, it's human being. And then population endpoints, you can have populations of fish. For human health is more into the epidemiology of things. But 3, 4, and 5, they don't have equivalents. So you can see that once you get to 1 or 2, the ecological risk assessment gets very complicated. And the message in this slide is that number 1, make sure you look at everything holistically. So not only the individual level effects, but also all the way to the ecosystem structure endpoint effects there. But also, if you are getting nowhere, I highly recommend that you find and retain services of a seasoned ecological risk assessor to help you through this process. Because if you don't, the potential risks could present themselves because, yeah, I'm protecting individuals. You know, I've chose very protective endpoints, but that's just not sufficient to understand the full effects on the ecosystem. So that's the message here, Not an easy answer. There's no quick solutions to this. You really need to dig deeper into that. That's the message there. Really quickly, looking at the conceptual site model for ecological receptors, similar to human being thinking, you have to know where the potential exposure pathways and routes. In this case, of course, you have the aquatic receptors in receiving waters, be it ponds or rivers or lakes. You also have potential in an unlikely scenario, groundwater impacts. And most of the time, ecological receptors are not concerned with groundwater unless there's a groundwater discharge subsurface or gets into surface somehow and then ends up in contact with ecological receptors. So you have both aquatic receptors and also terrestrial receptors, and everything is intermingled, combined. But again, the point of this slide is that make sure you pause, look at the big picture, make sure that you are accounting for all the potential exposure and toxicity elements for ecological receptors as well. Okay. All right, so a quick summary of this. Think about the exposure routes. Okay, so definitely ambient water, and that's contact ingestion. We also need to think about the bioaccumulation exposure pathway and bioconcentration, because those mechanisms do exist for some of the constituents. Just because it's not immediately toxic in a bioassay, so ambient exposure on bioassay, the concentrations, even low, over time, can lead to accumulation in the food chains, food webs, and that could be a point of exposure down the road. Now, inhalation pathway typically is not of great concern to ecological receptors. Now, in terms of the relevant endpoints for eco, growth, reproduction, survival are the three principal ones. So GRS. Everything else could be argued that may not end up impacting the population ecosystem. So these are the three principal ones. And then toxicity estimates. Yes, it's good to have LC50s or ED50s if there's internal intake. But for human health, usually it's ECs, effect concentrations, or incipient concentrations. And of course, since ecological receptors don't live enough out there, cancer effects are generally not relevant to ecological receptors. And then there's also the concept is that it is possible to, let's say, impact certain number of individuals in the population, so typically it's 20%, without significant noble effects of the population as a whole. So again, the goal, unless they are threatened endangered species, the overall goal is to protect the population ecosystems rather than individuals necessarily. Okay. Moving on. All right. So this is the most interesting, in my opinion, part of the presentation. And this is the scheme that employs all the toxicity risk assessment tenets and concept into how to look at the hazard evaluation of produced water elements, and then help you to identify key risk drivers, and then devote resources, limited resources to the top 10, 20, or 100, your choice. And so that you can have a better view of what key drivers are the most important in terms of eventual risk management, produced water, reclaimed water, treated produced water, and all that. So that's very important. Okay. So first, the first step, and I'm sure that's fairly self-explanatory, is really to generate a global database. Conceptual database and fact focus is great for that. Lots of chemicals have been reported over the years into the database, but also you may have some location-specific information that you've conducted testing, so analytical testing. so that you can inform the global database of possible chemicals out there if what was tested for. Sometimes you can also get your hands on the formulations, that there's anything that's different that's not reported in fracfocus.org. You may have access to that, especially if you are concerned with some of the proprietary elements that may not be publicly available, that nevertheless has to be considered in terms of actual risks. And some state programs also have testing mechanisms or ability to generate data for produced water. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, in action point, just generate some summary statistics so you can wrap your hand around it or even present it visually. Okay, so this was the exposure part of the risk scenario. And then next, let's look at the toxicity estimates. So huge databases out there to extract, publish information on toxicity of individual chemicals. CompTox is great. IRIS is still there. Ecotox for ecological receptors, RAISE as well. Great, fantastic resources, and they have grown over the decades. I worked with them for that. So you can have a great point of departure. But invariably, because the mixtures are so complex and they have so many constituents possible, you're going to run into data gaps. So what do you do now? Okay, Andrew, what do? I can't find any toxicity estimates for this chemical or the right type of toxicity estimates. Yeah, they have LD50s, but I don't want LD50s. I want EC20. Where can I find those? There's ways to find the information to fill the gaps. And I mentioned the concept of analogs and sentinel compounds. So in general environmental risk assessment, we've used those many times. And some of you are familiar for dioxins, which can be complex mixtures. We have the 237A, TCCDD, for RCRA 1254 for PCB mixtures, very well known, tested, toxicity reference values for that. And then if you want to look at individual PCB conjugates, we have PCB 126, and that's considered the most toxic. And all of these examples are the most toxic ones, so you're being conservative. And for things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, we have the benzoylpyrene as a representative of that group. So at least from the conservative first step, point of departure, you can find an analog potentially in the group. That's why I outlined the group approach, that you can do it by that way. If you're still coming up with nothing or very little to help you, then you can dive into predictive models. And TSCA, if you're not familiar with TSCA, Toxic Substance Control Act, is a great resource for the whole predictive scene of chemicals, because that very active environmental rule is charged with assessing new chemicals that are imported or produced in the US. So EPA scientists have to come up and predict toxicity and trade and transport as well of these brand new chemicals, for which there is also no data. So this is a great resource for you. ToxGas is also great, and Opera as well. And I also mentioned before, read across is great. So looking at the actual structure, molecular structure of known elements, genera can give you suggestions. All right, well, it's kind of like this chemical, and there is similarity indices based on those functional groups and its molecular shape, and also toxicity too. So you can mix and choose. So again, you don't have to have NA in your table. It's like not applicable or not available. You can actually spend a little bit of time for those important constituents, important in terms of detection, frequency, concentration, or maybe concern for risk. You can do extra steps today without much testing out there. I know we can do testing as well, whole effluent tests or individual chemical testing, but that's expensive, time consuming. This is all desktop, and you can at least predict or help you to prioritize chemicals. Yeah, you know what, Andrew, this is great. We can kind of wing it, but let's test those chemicals, those top 5 that the models are telling you that could be potentially associated with risk. And then also important to note that in your scheme, you need to provide specificity, at least for human health, whether a given chemical is associated with some type of cancer classification or not, because that changes things a lot. So that's the action point number 2. Moving quickly as I can, almost finished here. Of course, you need to estimate exposures. Either you can measure it or you can predict it. That's relatively. And here it is. Here's the slide that you can think of a systematic approach. So combining all the action points. And by the way, this is expandable. You can add as many categories as you wish. And also you can rank each category in terms of importance. Let's say if you think that toxicity for your risk management decision is the most important, or exposure, you can rank them. So as you can weight them. So you can do weighting 1 to 10, 1 to 5, whatever you want to do. So it's conceptually very easy. And how, of course, you work with it, that you looked at action point frequency. Okay, you can see that chemical B is the second most frequently observed chemical. Then linearly, you go across to action point number 2. However, chemical B has proven to be most toxic. And then look at the actual exposure. Well, now chemical B fall in the second position, so it's not as frequently exposed. But if you combine all those action points and any additional criteria that you wish, you're going to end up in a ranking. So this is very powerful because it's systematic, very amenable to group interaction and negotiations. And also, at the end of the day, the result is something that you can explain and publish and provide basis for scientifically. Why, let's say, Andrew, we're looking for something. This is the reason why. And again, this is a very simplistic approach, but nevertheless, a very good way of thinking how to combine all these multiple lines of evidence with various complexity and various aspects into one. Of course, if you want, you can also add uncertainty characteristics or criteria to it. So end of the day, you can see that chemical B is top of the list. However, due to uncertainty associated with each action point, we may want to rank it differently. So in the end, let's look at some of the last elements, and I'll stop right there to think about the whole evaluation scheme. Mixture toxicity. At this point, I only advise if you worry about co-occurring chemicals that have co-occurring exposures, especially if the same exposure pathway and routes are involved and effects in the same organ systems, plus risk assessment, additivity is the way to go, at least for the point of departure. You can ignore it. You can say, no, let's look at the individual chemicals one by one. But then, you do have to think about what happens if they're all together and they happen to have additive effect. So then you have to think about it a little bit differently. Of course, this is very amenable to site specificity, location specificity, or formation specificity. So it's very amenable to that. Of course, you can also inform it by adding actual bioassays. So for the toxicity, predicted toxicity, or published toxicity numbers, you can say, hey, okay, well, LD50 was 5 micrograms per liter, but, olefin toxic testing is, it's 1, there's something else in it. So let's keep looking for whatever fraction is the toxic one. And of course, the nice part of it is not only descriptive, but also quantitative. You can actually derive some numbers for key risk drivers and work with those numbers. And then ultimately, you can also choose to conduct a full risk assessment, be it human health, ecological, to inform your decision even better. Have a sort of scientific basis, can have a whole risk assessment report. to support your management decisions for that. And also nice thing about the quantitative risk assessment, you can back calculate allowable or permissible concentration limits in produced water elements, be it for human health or even treatment purposes. So that could be very nice for that. And also, as mentioned before, the scheme is expandable. You can add criteria for bioaccumulation, accumulation potential, and persistent half-life in human health or environment. So that's additional action points. And also, final point, all this is very amenable to AI as an accelerator. So it makes it very efficient, very quick, very much desktop, and you can save your precious resources to things that matter. So with this, this is the part that I'll be very interested to see if there's any comments or questions. I know we only have about 10 minutes, apologize for that, but maybe after the webinar, I'm available to answer questions after that. So with this, thank you so much for your attention. I was the one doing all the talking, but hopefully there's some questions now.